Hello, thank you for joining us. Today is Friday, May 29th, and I'm here with Dr. Shana for Ask Dr. Shana. Shana, what are we going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about how to raise children so that they can overcome their own anxiety and don't need their parents or someone of the parents' generation to help them out when they get anxious as an adult.
That's especially apropos for today's because there's so much anxiety, not only for the children, but for the adults.
Yes. So, I must admit that I'm borrowing some of what I'm saying from a leading psychologist named Anne-Marie Albano, who recently made a TED Talk, and the title of the TED Talk was How to Raise a Child Who Can Overcome Anxiety. And Miss Albano, or Dr. Albano, it didn't say which, is a psychologist of children and adolescents. And there was nothing new to me in what she said, but then, of course, TED Talks are rather brief. But the TED Talk number is 58992 if you want to look it up. Her big point was that anxious children should be coached as to how to solve their problem themselves. And parents who don't like to see their children suffering should not step in and call the school and call the principal and arrange everything for the child. Because if they do that, then the child will not learn how to cope with their own anxiety, and when they get to be an age when they should be leaving high school, let us assume that the children would be high school graduates, and set out on their own and get their own job and cope with life on their own, at least in the most basic kind of way. And she pointed out that the thing to do, that the parent can do when their child comes home anxious and possibly crying because some bully or other bothered them or something happened and they feel they could be the subject of mockery of their classmates or something like that. The thing to do is to of course, hug them and be understanding, but then say to them, okay, so it's tomorrow. What are you going to do when you run into that bully? What are you going to say to him? And make them come up with some suggestions, which the adult may modify to some extent. If somebody's been mean to you, the general idea of being mean back is not a good idea, because this might start a sort of ongoing fight between the two of you, and your child might not win this fight. So you have to say something which will establish that your child is not to be trifled with, at the same time not something so biting that it earns the bully's ongoing enmity.
Mm-hmm.
And because she said you produce a child who doesn't want to move away from home at age 18, doesn't want to start out on their own life, and is generally hanging around the house doing not much of anything, and their life is just being wasted.
Mm-hmm.
Added to which they become more and more dependent on their parents to straighten out any conflict or potential conflict for them. And having gone to all the trouble of raising a child to the age of 18, you won't want to go on doing all the coping for the child. And that's just a bad start in life, because at some point the child is going to have to learn to cope for themselves. And some of the most cruel things that I've seen is when a parent dies, and then the child is not only left with their grief for the parent, but also they feel they can hardly get out of bed because the parent's not there to straighten out whatever conflicts or potential conflicts they might have.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you don't want to raise a child who is a non-coper. And so resist the temptation to call the school or call the parents of the bully or do that sort of behind the scenes stuff for your child. Another thing that Ms. Albano or Dr. Albano, I wish they'd say which it was, did not get to, I suppose because of TED Talk time constraints, was the idea of the effect on children of seeing their parents trembling with anxiety. We talked several weeks ago about calling your bank, which is the mortgage holder, and making arrangements to be making payments on your mortgage, which might be less than your usual payment, and which will be added to the term of the loan. In other words, instead of finishing 20 some years from now, it'll maybe be back to a 30-year mortgage. But presumably by then, you will not have difficulty making the payments. And talking to other people that you owe money to, such as healthcare providers. They're quite used to hearing consumers call up and say, I have a bill for so much, could I pay it by so much a month? Now, as I said to you at the time, for heaven's sakes, don't make a bunch of agreements that add up to a monthly total that you can't possibly make. Because if you call, say, a bank that holds your mortgage and say, well, I won't be paying you so much money, but I'll agree to pay you a lesser amount, and then you don't make that payment, that makes the mortgage holder really upset with you. And entirely justified in their own minds in repossessing your house. And you don't want that. So I would say make the negotiations such that that takes maybe 80% of your anticipated income, and the other 20%, maybe your employer sends a check a little late or something like that. And if the check is a little late, call the bank and say, I've just been informed that the check will arrive 3 days after I'm supposed to pay you. I am anticipating getting the check in less than 72 hours, and I will immediately send you your money. So please, don't get a reputation that you negotiated something and then just blew them off. Now, the effect of having parents who are very anxious on a child is not good, because the child learns that normal behavior for adults is to be very anxious. And so they think that being very anxious themselves is just normal. And having the adrenaline running through your system all the time is toxic.
Mm-hmm.
It will affect your heart. It may affect your kidneys. I mean, it's not good. So, seeing the parents concerned about how to pay everything and hearing that they're negotiating with the people they owe money to, now that's a good example, because when you're negotiating, you're coping with the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets the message to the children of, when you have a financial problem, what you do is you call up the people you owe money to and make an agreement. But it has to be an agreement you can stick to.
Mm-hmm. Is there, I recall you telling me a story about how your father helped teach you and how you were able to deal with your anxiety. And I thought that was a wonderful story, and it kind of dovetails with what Dr. Albano was kind of talking about.
Yes. When I came home anxious because some bully had pushed me down, and I usually didn't mention it the first or the second or the third time because it was such a common experience for me, he would say, okay, it's tomorrow morning. What are you going to do when you see that bully? And one of the things that I came up with was to say, you have pushed me down 3 times when I was just trying to get to my seat in class. Don't you think this is becoming a little bit boring? The same thing over and over and over.
Wow, that was perfect, because you didn't get angry. You just kind of pointed out a fact, and it was boring.
So, and plus, every time I get pushed down and I get bruised or scratched or whatever, I have to go to the school nurse and she'll talk to the principal, and eventually your parents will hear about it and then you'll hear about it. So it has fallout which you wouldn't like. So how about today you just let me get to my seat? And that becomes the usual between us. We don't have to be best friends. We don't have to say anything terrifically positive about each other. We just let each other go by, and then I don't get sent to the school nurse who doesn't call the principal, who doesn't call your parents. And it's not so boring to everybody else in the class, because I'm sure you don't want to be known as a big bore. So that was one. Another thing that I would frequently do was use big words, which were appropriate. They weren't totally out of left field, but it would make the bully stand there scratching his head saying, "What? What did she say?" And in those few seconds of my opponent's perplexity, I could scram. And so by the time he's come back to present reality, I'm not there anymore. I said that somebody was behaving idiosyncratically one time. And that was one of those, huh? Now, idiosyncratic, as I'm sure some of you know, means original and unique to only this person, not what everybody would do. And, but the person I said it to was completely nonplussed, because he'd said something very mean, and I said, well, I frequently have idiosyncratic reactions. And by the time it took him to recover from being presented with a word he didn't understand, I was out in the hallway. So that's another one. Later on that day, when he was in the lunch line, which is one place you don't want to be acting up because you'll be taken out of the lunch line and put to the end of the line, I explained him what idiosyncratic meant. So, at one school, I made a friend of a bully because I said to a third party, well, he just bullies people when he's confronted with something he doesn't understand. Mm-hmm. If you explain it to him, the bullying stops. And since this boy had bullied several of my classmates, he found his stock going up. People started treating him as a normal person, and he decided to live up to that assessment.
I wonder if his bullying was in response to feeling inadequate, not knowing what these words meant, and actually feeling like he was being belittled because he didn't know the words. And once you explained it to him, it was he kind of it showed that you cared about him, and then he kind of didn't feel ashamed to be possibly ignorant. I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, well, his family were recent immigrants from, I've forgotten which part of Russia, and none of them spoke English well, and being Russian at that time, this is the middle 50s, in the United States, was not the best calling card you could have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually ended up informally helping him with his English. And since I was his English, I would not say teacher, but I'd say coach, he sort of became rather friendly. And I explained, for instance, I would explain various slang expressions that were used that were not in his English dictionary. So how is he supposed to cope? And so I would tell him what it meant in straight English, and in a sort of a way, we became, well, at least we tolerated each other. We didn't ever become bosom friends because, and he was very lost. And his parents also had difficulty when talking with the school because the school frequently did not use standard English. They used American slang. And his parents, while wanting very much to get along with the school, didn't necessarily get it. So, and that's one thing that I would say, if anybody is trying to get along with immigrants, use short words in standard English. Don't use one of the very many expressions we have which doesn't mean what it says it means. For instance, we say it was raining cats and dogs. Well, we don't actually mean that cats and dogs are coming out of the sky. If we would say it's raining very hard, that might get it across better. That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a good thing for children to see parents concerned and coping with the concern. It is not a good thing for children to see their parents collapse on the sofa saying, I don't know what is going to become of us. We're going to, So maybe if they, being human, need to do that once in a while, maybe they could do it in their own bedroom or somewhere where the children are not watching.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is a little not quite transparent, but the child, if they see their parents dissolving into tears, thinks, oh my goodness, my parents don't know how to cope, and they are 10 times as anxious.
And they see the parents' coping strategy as just being is to cry and to be helpless and not to try and sit down and figure out what's my next step? What can I do here?
Yes. And in this country, recent experiences with black people in Minnesota notwithstanding, generally speaking, it is not considered normal to arrest someone unless you really have some evidence that they may be involved in a serious crime. And it is not considered, as far as I know, we have people who go to bed hungry, which I think is scandalous, and I contribute as much as I can to various organizations which fund the food banks and, various things. I do my part. But generally speaking, we don't have people dying of starvation in this country. And so I think the worst thing a child could think about is being forced out of their house, which is pretty bad for a child. A child needs to feel loved, cared about, and that's why do listen to a child's complaint of anxiety or of bullying or of whatever it might be, and safe. In other words, they will be fed, they will be housed, and they will be cuddled and told, you're my son or my daughter and I'm proud of you.
Mm-hmm.
And if a change comes to the family, for instance, the father is not allowed to go to his job, but the mother does find a part-time job, and so the kids are going to be without mom. Maybe she's arranged that the neighbor will take her kids. Explain it as coping to the child. Look, we're missing your father's income, so to have some money, your mother is going to go to work.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can respect their parents for coping and for not letting go of the idea that the parents have to provide for their children.
Well, this has been great. What is there any last thoughts we need to discuss before we end up here?
I'd just say once again, don't cope for the children. Help them learn to cope. And I guess that's about it. My next topic, unless I get an email either on my website, which is Dr. D-O-C-T-O-R, Shana.net, or in my email address, which is Dr. D-O-C-T-O-R, Shana, Shana, Clark, Clark, 1, the number 1, at gmail.com. Or you can call me. My number is 585-730-0574. And the best time to call me is toward the end of the day, like 4 or 5 p.m., because I often have appointments earlier on. And if you called just as I was about to enter a doctor's office, I'd have to say, look, I'll call you back. And I prefer not to play telephone tag, but my plan for next week is about how to complain. Goodbye.